Hello and welcome to the latest in Jinnah Institute's weekend webinar series. My name is Amara Durrani. I'm JI Senior Fellow. I thank all our audience to be tuning in for yet another fascinating discussion on Afghanistan and the peace process as it moved forward. The last few days have witnessed a number of swift political developments in Kabul, despite ongoing violence, which has increased hopes for the start of intra Afghan negotiations. There was a high level delegation of the Taliban visiting Pakistan and having meetings with high level government functionaries. It was followed by a positive phone call between Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan and Dr. Abdullah, who's leading the High Council for National Reconciliation. And there are reports that the Taliban and the Afghan negotiating team are now on their way to Doha to start an intra Afghan dialogue. As always, we have with us today a very illustrious panel of esteemed speakers, frontline policy practitioners, and thinkers who have been part of Afghan issues and Afghan matters for years and have seen the situation on the ground from up front. I'd like to introduce our panel for today before we start our discussion. The session is chaired by President Jinnah Institute, Senator Sherry Rahman, who is former federal minister and Pakistan ambassador to the US. She's also currently chair of Pakistan Senate Standing Committee on China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Among the panel of speakers, we are joined by His Excellency Dr. Mustafa Mastoor, who is the Afghanistan Minister of Economy with an impressive track record of international institutions work on Afghanistan governance and economy. We're joined by His Excellency Ambassador Stefano Pontecorvo, who is NATO's senior civilian representative to Afghanistan. He's also the former Italian ambassador to Pakistan. We have Ambassador Richard G. Olson, who was the former U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He was also ambassador to Pakistan, and he's currently senior advisor to USIP. We have Ambassador Omar Samad, former Afghan diplomat with postings in North America and Europe, currently Senior Fellow Atlantic Council. And last but not the least, we have senior Pakistan journalist Rahimullah Yousafzai. I thank all our panel speakers to be joining us today. This session is being broadcast live on Jinnah Institute's YouTube and Facebook platforms. It is also being live tweeted on our Twitter handle at Jinnah Institute. Audience can share their comments and their questions through these platforms. Without much ado, may I request the chair, Senator Sherry Rahman, to open with her remarks? Sherry, please unmute
Yes,
your mic.
yes. Thank you very much, Amara, for that introduction. And to all our illustrious and honorable speakers, a very warm welcome. Thank you again for joining us at different times of the clock, as you call it. And we will proceed today to unpack a few questions that I think bedevil what our title is about today, and it says Quagmire and how to get past it. One of the things that I think we need to look at is an information deficit on how events are unfolding, what is actually happening on the ground, the difference between posture and facts, which we have seen has been quite a mover of momentum in Afghanistan in the past, specifically over the last 18 years. We've had different iterations of support from the multilateral community, from the United States, from various regional actors. And at this stage of the peace process, which I think all of us here today are greatly invested in, we need to be looking at, and I'm hoping for a rich and robust conversation with some critical thinking that we can apply to all our positions in looking at some of the unfolding contradictions and concerns that are rising in this very long and long awaited peace process. My first question would really be the deal between the Taliban and the United States is obviously a milestone agreement, and it's been something that has met with great relief from many quarters. But I'm not sure, as we stand today, how it's unfolding in terms of guarantees for guaranteeing a stable, secure, inclusive, and democratic a governance future for Afghanistan, which many of us hold as key to regional stability. Now, Afghanistan has gone through a long period of war, and this isn't the first one. And I want to move away from cliches and speak to, because we have very important interlocutors here, speak to the reality on the ground, what each player can be offered as an incentive to move towards closer to the ideals of a constitutional peaceful transition. But having said that, of course, there are key concerns about escalating violence in 2020, and many do ask if this agreement is simply an exit agreement or a withdrawal agreement for the United States, uh, perhaps looking at it as a proxy for peace, because so far we are at a place where, as violence escalates and the ceasefire that was one of the key conditions for going forward is obviously right now evading the fog of war and even the smog of peace. So the point here is to maybe disabuse each other of knowledge deficits and concerns that are rising, because that's the only way they can be addressed. I won't be front loading this with too many of my remarks, but just flagging some concerns that will arise and then we'll sum up in the end. Right now, as it stands, it looks like, as I said, the violence is escalating, and yet the Afghan government has, of course, the trump card of power, which it can share. The Taliban right now have in their hand the battlefield gains they have made. For those of us looking at Afghanistan from the outside with a huge investment in peace and inclusivity, are looking to a situation where we feel that the divisions between various factions, the Taliban themselves, what if indeed what they promise can be delivered on the ground, if they're able to brush over their differences. There are key hardliners, and this happens in every long conflict. The hardliners have emerged as well as the moderates who are invested more in power sharing. Then we also have concerns, obviously, questions being raised about whether the Afghan government itself can go forward ineluctably towards a situation where it needs to be critically united to face a very powerful, now I wouldn't say adversary, but certainly a potential partner in a constitutional framework that has yet to be worked out, particularly in view of keeping some of the gains that the international community and civil society in Afghanistan have actually made. And I'd like to say at this point that Pakistan's position is very clear on this, that peace is one of the end states we would like to see, because that is the only way we can ensure stability in our neighborhood. And it should be as inclusive as it can be. Having said that, we are no one to state concerns beyond a point, other than those that impact us, so because we share the longest porous border with Afghanistan and a history of engagement and even disengagement. So this is a good turning point. It's a transition that we can call an inflection point where we work through what is a broad series of concerns about how this peace agreement plays out. It will certainly take a while. It will be calibrated, I'm sure, and there will be reversals, but key questions remain about how fragile this is and how long the United States will commit its time and resources, what sustainability will there be to its engagements, and if not, perhaps the European Union and the community, who will be multilaterally seeing the glue of multilateral engagement through with Afghanistan, and how long do we expect to see Afghanistan grapple with, and the minister, I'm sure, would like to address this, the solvency issues, the narcotics economy, And how long would we expect to see Afghanistan grappling with its constitutional and political value systems that the Taliban are looking to renegotiate? In this, of course, protections for minorities and women are front and center in my mind right now, as well as, of course, the number of foreign terrorist groups that have also found a little bit of redoubt in Afghan soil, not necessarily at all nurtured, but they are a problem, as well as Al Qaeda and the Khorasan Islamic State, which is, of course, linked to many other groups. And we also have TTP, Pakistan's clear enemy, also sending signals from there. So there are concerns which we can unbundle and hope to be doing this in a fashion where we are building bridges towards each other as opposed to away. So thank you very much for joining us and for your tolerance and patience. Please, Amara, over to you.
Thank you, Sherry, for setting an important context and for highlighting this discussion really to be a platform of exchanging information and views to demystify the process in Afghanistan. I want to start by turning to our esteemed Afghan speakers. First, Minister of Economy, Dr. Mustafa Mastoor. Minister, could you share with us the current status of the start of the intra-Afghan negotiations? Has the government team left for Doha? What is its agenda? What do you hope to accomplish during the dialogue?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I'm really pleased to be part of a panel with very distinguished panelists with rich experience, and some of them my great friends and colleagues, and for a very important issue, which is peace in Afghanistan. At least after 42 years, definitely this country needs, as Ambassador Sherry Rahman was mentioning, an inclusive and democratic peace here. To give you an update, here in Kabul, now we have the High Council for National Reconciliation formed. A new Minister for Peace is taking his seat, and the negotiation team is fully ready to depart to Doha. Most probably tomorrow at this time, they may depart to Doha, towards Doha, but they were waiting for the return of the Taliban delegation from Pakistan. And this was why there was a few days delay on that one. The first meeting definitely is to break the ice and just to meet each other, and then start with the easier issues and going towards the difficult ones. So we are optimistic. The Afghan people have really, they're looking all eyes towards the two teams and those who are hosting, those who are facilitating, and those who are helping, particularly the United States of America and all our allies, including our neighbors, particularly Pakistan. I think Ambassador Pontecorvo would have been the last one who met the delegation in this team, and this is all updates from this side.
Thank you, Minister Mastoor. Just a quick follow-up question. You mentioned the easy issues versus the difficult issues. Could you identify for us briefly what could those potentially easy issues be to begin with?
First of all, they may work on a framework for the negotiation. I don't think that the red lines will be the first issues to discuss here. The ceasefire is one of the main issues to discuss, particularly the comprehensive ceasefire. One of the main concerns inside Afghanistan, and all experts who have a better understanding of the Taliban, they have a concern of their ability to be able to control a comprehensive ceasefire overall their controlled territory, because They trained their local commanders to be autonomous, particularly in finding resources. I'm not sure whether the local commanders will fully abide the Doha decision on the comprehensive ceasefire. This is why one of the main issues would be how to maintain those ceasefire, and the confidence building measures would be discussed in the first meeting. So the first meeting shouldn't be with a long agenda, at least these issues, plus where will be the next meeting. We are thankful to Qatar government for hosting this first meeting, particularly in the time that COVID is a big challenge for everyone, and how in the future either it will be continued in Doha or whether it will be somewhere else. So these may be the main issues from our side. But since we were not in direct contact with Taliban, we are not fully sure what will be the first issues by their side.
Thank you, Minister Mustafa. Ambassador Umar Samad. So there have been unconfirmed reports going around over social media in the last few days about what could potentially be the respective agendas of the two sides, the Taliban and the negotiating team. And they seem to be at total odds with each other and very rigid. It seems as if there may not be a breakthrough. How much of the current democratic system in Afghanistan do you think can realistically be salvaged during the negotiations?
Well, assalamu alaikum, and thank you again to Jinnah Institute, and great to be on this panel with very well-informed participants. You raised a very tough question so early in this discussion, but yes, I think that there are a lot of unknowns. I think that we are on a path finally. The path is the very beginning of a new chapter, in my opinion. And this chapter may be obviously a very difficult one, and it could be a very long one. Hopefully, we all hope and pray that it will be short and it will have very good results for Afghanistan, the region, and the world. But having said this, we are at the beginning of a new process. And the beginning is going to look more or less full of formalities and greet and meet and sort of protocol issues. It's going to be a photo op for some, especially the Americans are looking forward to showing that the process is moving forward. Kabul and the Afghan government is trying to say that they are defending and they are representing a certain set of values and a system and a popular will. And the Taliban are coming to the table saying, well, we are an entity that cannot be ignored. We have at least maintained control of our territories, and we have a deal with the Americans on one hand, and now it's the time to see if we can strike an agreement and an understanding with the rest of Afghanistan. And then on top of this, obviously, you have the neighbors, the regional players, all the different driving forces close and beyond Afghanistan. And you have the greater pulls and pushes of international relations and great power rivalries and so on, also impacting the Afghan endgame. And I say endgame because I think that we have reached an endgame, but we do not know how difficult it's going to be and how long it's going to last. But those issues that you brought up in terms of whether a democratic system can be maintained, to what extent are we going to show flexibility, are the two sides going to agree on a model that works best for Afghanistan? I think that we have, as Minister Mastur said, 42 years of conflict behind us, and we're looking for no more conflict ahead of time. But we have also 42 years of lessons to be drawn from Afghanistan's history, Afghanistan's society, Afghanistan's place in the region and in the world. It's the threats that Afghanistan is facing and the threats that the world could face in case Afghanistan is not stable and at peace. So I think that we need to draw very deep and meaningful lessons from the past 42 years when moving forward, and I hope we can address some of those in the next few minutes.
Thank you. Ambassador Pontecorvo, Minister Mastur mentioned that the negotiating team's last meeting was with yourself. What are your expectations from this dialogue in Doha, and how is NATO's role transitioning in Afghanistan? You've been having a number of meetings in Afghanistan with civil society, with all stakeholders of peace. It seems as if NATO is transitioning for a different kind of role. Can you elaborate on how NATO is setting itself for the troop withdrawal and for the peace process?
There you go. Yes, well, I can partially answer some of these questions. First of all, I'd like to reiterate that it is a pleasure, as other speakers have said, to join this Jinn Institute webinar, see a lot of old friends and a lot of people I've heard about, like Ambassador Olson, on the future of Afghanistan, alongside other distinguished speakers. And this webinar could not have been timelier. Maybe, Sherry, you're into something because you got it the day before, as Minister Mastur said, the day before the team is leaving for Doha. Effectively, I think this is a historical occasion. History is being made as Afghan delegations are preparing to gather in Doha. And we are waiting also for the start of intra-Afghan negotiations. And I think the Ambassador Khalizad has pulled off a very, very demanding job in getting this thing started. This will not be an easy process, as people before me have already said. In any negotiations, compromise will be necessary, and the degree of a compromise will make or break the talks, or will be seen as a success or as something else. The common denominator must be reaching dignified peace, and here the catchword is dignified, for the Afghan people of all generations, ethnicities, and genders. And here, what Sherry said before is absolutely paramount. To this end, we hope that both sides will show flexibility, good faith, and determination in pursuing this goal, putting an end to the conflict that has caused too much pain and suffering. First and foremost, a significant reduction in violence must top the negotiations agenda to give people confidence in the process and its outcome. Popular support is essential for a durable outcome. Peace can only be lasting if it safeguards the gains of the past 19 years that Afghans worked so hard for under the security umbrella that NATO has provided, but the gains are to be ascribed to the Afghan people themselves, certainly not been pushed upon. These gains, made with the help of the international community, and I remind myself, before I remind others, have taken the form of higher life expectancy, lower child mortality, more children in school, including girls, freedom of expression, and significant participation of women in public life, in pretty prominent positions. This progress has been made possible in an environment where human rights and civil rights are respected, and no Afghan wants to see these gains reversed, and nor do we. Now I come to the question of NATO. As NATO, we have a vested interest in sustaining the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Over the years, NATO and its partners have trained and funded the Afghan National Army and police. As a result, the Afghan Security Forces and its institutions, important to remember, are now professional, capable, and coordinated. Importantly, they are also an institution exemplifying the unity of the Afghan nation. They will continue to be a crucial pillar of Afghanistan's long-term security, stability, and sovereignty, preventing international and national terrorist groups from gaining a foothold in Afghanistan. As NATO, we are determined to helping Afghanistan towards lasting peace, whilst respecting the nature of intra-Afghan dialogue. This is something that we remind each other all the time. This is a dialogue between Afghans, mainly through our Resolute Support Mission, which continues to train, advise, and assist the Afghan security forces. We will also continue our funding for the security forces and institution. In support of the peace process, we are adjusting our troop presence in line with the US-Taliban peace agreement. It is important that the region also stands with the people of Afghanistan, and I welcome, Sherry, what you said on the interest of Pakistan. This is a country which I know well and which I've learned to respect and to love. We welcome efforts by the Afghan government to forge regional consensus on the peace process, and I believe there is now a strong understanding among the neighboring countries that a peaceful Afghanistan will benefit the region. No one wants to see Afghanistan revert to being a safe haven for terrorism. Stability in Afghanistan can enhance economic prosperity through better connectivity, increased trade, and energy projects. Let me close by reiterating that this moment for peace is unique and the stakes are high. The Afghan people and the world are watching. They will not forget or forgive whoever loses this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pontecorvo. That was a comprehensive NATO perspective and outlook on the process. Before I come to Ambassador Olson, Rahimullah Saab, I want to quickly ask you your rejoinder to Minister Mastoor's very important point, how both sides may actually start with the question of an immediate comprehensive ceasefire, and whether the Taliban would be able to really implement a comprehensive ceasefire at their lowest hierarchical level. What is your sense? If even if there is an agreement on a comprehensive ceasefire, would the Taliban be able to implement it? What is your sense from the ground?
Okay, let me first thank Jinnah Institute for inviting me, and I believe I am in a distinguished company in this panel uh, regarding the question of a comprehensive ceasefire. Let me say that this is an old demand of the Afghan government and the US and maybe everybody else, because they wanted a reduction in violence that will create the right conditions for the peace process. That has not happened. I believe this is going to be the first and foremost demand of the Afghan negotiating team. I think that Taliban will not immediately agree to a ceasefire. Uh, they will start with other issues. I think ceasefire will be discussed. It is possible that Taliban later agree to reduction in violence, as they did in the case with the US, 1 week before the peace agreement in Doha. So from 22nd February to 29th February, there was a 1 week reduction in violence announced by the Taliban. And I remember the US being satisfied with the reduction in violence, and that's why they agreed to sign the agreement on 29th of February. So there could be reduction in violence, maybe in installments. They do it once for a shorter period, maybe then they do it for a longer period, then they wait for the response from the other side. That is a possibility. But I think it will depend on many things. It's very important to reduce the violence. That could then lead to a comprehensive long-term ceasefire. But I think for ceasefire to work will require trust and also the implementation of whatever has been agreed already. So, I mean, the Doha agreement has to be fully implemented, and then whatever is agreed initially in the inter-Afghan negotiation also has to be implemented. As to the question whether the Taliban leadership, the Rahbari Shura, the so-called Leadership Council, uh, or the Political Commission Office in Doha, and the negotiating team, which has 23 members, and amazingly, 65% of these negotiators are members of the Leadership Council or Rahbari Shura. So they are top ranking people who have been included in the negotiating team. And I think it was an old US demand. They were complaining that the Taliban Political Commission in Doha is not fully empowered. They have to go back to the Rahbari Shura to seek guidance and permission, and then the talks are delayed or suspended. So now they have 65% of the members who are from the Rehbari Shura, but still they have to seek final permission and guidance from the leader, the supreme leader, Sheikh Habatullah Khunzada, and some of the other Shura members who are not part of the negotiating team. So whether the Taliban Political Commission can implement the ceasefire. If you look at the past, a few short ceasefires have been announced. Reduction in violence was agreed upon. And as far as we can see it from here, those were implemented. The Americans actually expressed satisfaction with the, reduction in violence. But still there was some violence. Still there were some local commanders who continued to launch attack. So that will happen in any case. I don't expect a very full, complete, comprehensive, fully implemented ceasefire. There will be violations, but I think violations can take place from both sides. So if one side violates, the other side may also violate. So we will need a lot of homework to do this. It's not going to be easy.
Thank you, Raimullah Saab. I know a number of security analysts would agree with your realistic assessment. Ambassador Olson, I want to come to you now, sir. Uh, Raimullah Saab raised a very important point that complete compliance of the agreement falls on both sides, not just on the Taliban. Now, it is possible, a comprehensive ceasefire is possible only if both sides carry out their agreement. In the last couple of months, the US role in Afghanistan has become mystified, not least because of the election debates in the United States. It's become a big question mark as to what the US policy would be in Afghanistan after the November elections. In your view, how is the US positioning itself for implementation and success of the intra-Afghan dialogue and compliance by both sides, and whether the US still has the enough leverage over both sides to make it work?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and to the audience, good afternoon and salam alaikum. It's really great to be with a bunch of old and new friends here today to discuss this important topic. So let me start by talking a little bit about the domestic political backdrop for U.S. policy. I think it's very fair to say that public enthusiasm for the war in Afghanistan in the United States has drained away. There's not really active opposition, but over the course of 19, 20 years, one of our longest wars, the public enthusiasm has lagged, probably from about 2011. The second point with regard to U.S. foreign policy is that counterterrorism is no longer the central organizing theme of U.S. foreign policy. It has largely been superseded in this administration by so-called great power competition, and that may change that name, but there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States right now that the challenge of dealing with a rising China is the most important objective in U.S. foreign policy. And this is even prior to COVID, and we have no idea what the pandemic is going to do in terms of U.S. policy priorities. I'll give you one very small example. It may seem a bit strange, but the U.S. Marine Corps, which of course was for a long time a significant presence in Afghanistan and operated as a mini army, is changing its doctrine, and it is getting rid of its tanks and going back to being a purely amphibious assault force, with the expectation that in a future military confrontation, that's what they will be called upon to do. What this means is they're not really going to be available in Afghanistan, amongst other things. So I think in that sense, to answer Ambassador Sherry Rahman's very excellent question, there's no doubt that the U.S. is looking to exit from Afghanistan. But the question to me, is it going to be a clean exit or a dirty exit? And, you know, against all the factors that I laid out before, no U.S. president is going to want to pull out U.S. forces when it immediately results in chaos and potentially even another attack on the U.S. homeland. So, you know, President Obama wanted out of Afghanistan. President Trump has wanted out of Afghanistan, at least in terms of troops, and it hasn't happened. The U.S. has chosen to pursue a policy of seeking a political settlement that hopes to preserve some of the gains that have been made in Afghan society over the past 20 years, especially with regards to rights of women and minorities, while at the same time allowing for some level of troop withdrawal. But even the troop withdrawals, it's important to remember, are phased and conditional. And this was Ambassador Khalilzad's great accomplishment in the Doha Agreement. We accomplished a partial withdrawal. There's talk, rumors in the air of possible further drawdowns, but it's clear there will be some residual force in the U.S. force, I would say, until May of 2021. And at that point, whatever administration is in charge in the United States will face the challenge of deciding whether the conditions in Afghanistan allow for the final withdrawal, as is called for in the Doha Agreement, or those conditions have not been met. Now, let's be clear, from the U.S. perspective, those conditions are primarily about counterterrorism and the verification that the Taliban has indeed lived up to its commitments regarding Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that are in the Doha Accord. But I think the other factor will be the progress of intra-Afghan negotiations. Just one final point before I wrap up. It seems to me that part of this debate in the United States is very much about troop levels, and that's, I think, an unfortunate way to cast the question. It in a funny way parallels very much the Taliban's approach to U.S. position in Afghanistan. I think the question for the U.S. really is whether to remain engaged or not engaged with Afghanistan, and that is the danger. The danger, if I would say, of a truly dirty withdrawal or a dirty exit, is if the United States were to choose to completely disengage, as it had done in 1989, 1990 from the region. And I think that there are, I would hope certainly that those of us who follow Afghan policy closely and who are advising, people in power, that would be a real mistake. And that, it seems to me, is the real test. It's not so much the troop levels, it's the level of engagement that the U.S. will continue to show with Afghanistan, even as we enter, as Ambassador Samad said, the end game. Thank you.
Ambassador Olson, follow-up question. So, I mean, that's I think the heart of the matter for future U.S. policy in not only Afghanistan but also the region. And I note your point about the rise of China and how the U.S. is positioning itself with that question. What could be the contours, in your view, of a future U.S. engagement in Afghanistan to avoid the dirty exit? There have been, visits to put forward on the table financial and connectivity future plans with the U.S. supporting those processes, but they haven't really become center stage in U.S. Domestic debate on the question of Afghanistan. What could be the contours for a future engagement? What ought to be a logical stance to avoid?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing, I mean, obviously there's this question of what the U.S. does at the time of the May 2021 deadline. The question of whether the conditions allow for the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces in accordance with Doha. And, I have to say that my sense of the politics of this is that, a complete, finalizing the Doha agreement would be probably the preference of either political party in the United States. But I think it would have to be a judgment that we made at the time. But beyond that, I think a quite important question, perhaps even the more important question, is whether the U.S. continues to provide assistance to the government of Afghanistan in two areas. First of all, the provision of assistance to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, which are in fact quite dependent on foreign assistance. They're increasingly capable, at least the commandos in the Air Force, and I think are able to continue to hold the ground if there is continued fighting. Secondarily, I think that the assistance levels have to be sufficient to maintain the survivability of the Afghan government, which is similarly in a position of being quite dependent on foreign assistance. Now, especially with the latter, this is not purely a U.S. question, or even primarily a U.S. question. I mean, most of the assistance flows from multilateral donors and from our European friends and Japanese friends and other allies. So I would say, the important thing is for the U.S. to continue to, support the Afghan security forces, even if they may be transitioning. Ideally in a post-settlement, there may be a change in the composition of the forces. And then on the question of economic assistance, the U.S. has to continue to take the leading role that it has played up until now in various donor organizations or donor conferences. In fact, I think there's probably room to say that it could up its game as opposed to how it's been doing over the past couple of years. Over.
Thank you, Ambassador Olson. I want to take your pertinent point about continuation of international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan to Minister Mustafa Mastoor, who's the Minister of Economy in Afghanistan. Minister Mastoor, the point about continuation of international assistance to Afghanistan, this is now becoming one of the big debate points within Afghanistan. There are questions about how trillions of dollars have been poured into Afghanistan in aid over 20 years, and yet it has not yielded the kind of impact and result in solidifying Afghanistan, in building the infrastructure, governance, and society as it should have. There are big question marks now on transparency, on accountability. That puts Afghanistan in a very difficult situation. It's a big question mark for donors to continue providing that level of assistance to Afghanistan. How is the Afghan government dealing with this current place of uncertainty? What are some of the key challenges that you're foreseeing in terms of continuation of assistance?
Amara, just before I come to this point, very briefly to what Rahimullah Yusuf Zaiseb said related to comprehensive ceasefire versus reduction in violence. As you know, when we are talking about a peace deal, we're talking about something that should have the full support of the public as well. The reduction of violence may not have the full support while the negotiation is going on there, if there are other incidents in the country. Because the confidence building, what all of the speakers already said, is the most important thing between the two parties, that they were in conflict with each other for the past 25 years. At least the prisoner release was a significant flexibility by the government side. 5,000 prisoners, some of which was already had a death penalty, versus to 1,000 which were with Taliban. You know that on a number of them, some partners also had concerns. Yesterday, the Queen's University in Belfast published a report that 68% of those who were released, they are back in the battlefield. And some of them are the so-called Taliban governor of the province or governor of the district. So all of these things needs a serious confidence building between the two sides. So a reduction of violence may not get the right support of the general public. And this is why we in the government, despite all the problems, all the demands by the public, we released 5,000 of those prisoners that some of them were really dangerous. And when we are talking about 68% of them back in the battlefield, we lose the support of the public why we have done so. So this is why there is a huge demand on the Taliban side so that as much as possible, they work on the ceasefire. On the question that you mentioned on the continuation of the international support, as a Minister of Economy for the last 2 years and as a Secretary of Finance for the past 9 years, I know how much support those generous assistance provided to the Afghan people. But we should not forget the realities that on average 30% of our budget, 35% of our budget spend on the security. So whatever we receive, 35% we back spend on the security, which does not get other services to the people. 35% of the support is spent on the reconstruction or rebuilding of what destroyed by the war. So overall, 70% of our annual budget is spent back on war-related issues. Only 30% of that remains for the services and what everybody is looking at that, at least in the last 20 years, you thought that it should have provided much in the picture. But if you see the current Afghanistan, it's not the Afghanistan of 2001. I always been here, lived here, and worked here, even during the Taliban time. At least maybe with a little bit longer beard and with no tie, but I was working here. And I see the current Afghanistan much different from that time. And this was not without the support of the international community. Now we are expecting a conference in November, a pledging conference, though we are working with the international community whether this pledging conference will be for a normal or usual 4 years, or whether we stay for the result of the peace negotiation, and at least we will have a 1-year pledging conference. But we do understand the realities of those partner countries as well, particularly those who badly affected by the COVID. So overall, we are thankful to those generous support. It provided big support to the Afghan nation, but the continuous war took a lot, or almost 70% of what we have received.
Thank you. Before I go to Ambassador Samad Raimullah Sahab, would you want to respond to Minister Mastoor's comment on the comprehensive ceasefire implementation?
I think I agree with you. I was saying that, giving some past instances of reduction in violence, especially on the occasion of Eid and before the Doha Agreement. So I think even that reduction in violence actually created a lot of hopes. Whenever there is violence, even if it is reduced violence, it creates uncertainty and it provokes the other side. So that's why I fully agree that there has to be a comprehensive ceasefire to create the proper conditions for the peace talks. But what I am saying is that maybe Taliban initially may not agree to a complete ceasefire, because let us all, look at the past. Taliban have used violence to achieve their objectives. They have this military power and they have used it, and that was the reason the US agreed to negotiate with Taliban. even in the absence of the Afghan government. So I think because they have benefited by using violence, by launching more attacks, that's why they will be tempted to do so as long as they don't achieve what they want to achieve in the intra-Afghan negotiations. And that is the reason I have this feeling that maybe initially they will agree to some kind of reduction in violence, which I know it has been criticized by the Afghan government. And I think the majority of Afghan people, I think most Afghans, they want a complete ceasefire. But, this is what is, I believe, a possibility that maybe initially there would be phases in reduction of violence, and that could lead to comprehensive ceasefire. But that will then depend on implementing on the agreements which have already been reached in Doha and now in the intra-Afghan negotiations. So I'm not saying that I'm in favor only, in reduction of violence. Reduction of violence is good if you cannot have a complete ceasefire. But I think everybody should strive to get a comprehensive ceasefire. That should be the real objective.
Thank you, Ambassador Samad. So the question about behavior change in Taliban remains a big question. But I think a countervailing question could be that the Afghan side, and that includes the Afghan government as well as the political constituencies led by former President Karzai, Dr. Abdullah, and others, they also ought to have a certain unified stance in order to negotiate with the Taliban and bring about a transition in their behavior. But we do not see that, frankly, at the moment. There are increasing disruptions, ruptures within the Afghan polity. This past week, Dr. Abdullah and former President Karzai have dissociated themselves with the High Council, and there seems to be growing convergence between former President Karzai and Dr. Abdullah, ostensibly against President Ghani. How can there be stronger Afghan polity? Is there a possibility to bring about the change within the Taliban?
It's a very pertinent question and something that I have been trying to hammer in and try to get the message out to Kabul for the past 2 years. Unfortunately, we have seen some progress, but also not enough. There's not enough consensus in Kabul because let me say that even in regards to the ceasefire or reduction in violence issue, what really matters on a global scale is political will. Is there political will for peace in this country after 42 years? Or is this sort of a game that is being played because of power and because of continuity and durability? Whether it's on the Taliban side using violence, as Mr. Yousafzai alluded to, in order to reach their political goals, or whether it's from the government side or certain circles within the government who have other motivations that drive them. And then let's not forget, we all talk about what the intentions are on each side, but there are also third parties and there are spoilers who also play a role in this affair, and they can be disrupted as well. Now, as far as Kabul is concerned, they all like to think, and since I'm no longer in government, I can speak a bit more openly, but they all like to think about defending the republic and their values in the last 19 years. And that is all good. We need to defend anything that the Afghan people believe in. And Afghan people is not just Kabul or a few centers in Kabul. Afghan people, we have to realize now, means the whole country, means those who oppose you and even those who fight you. So in order for us to move forward, we need to have a very broad understanding and belief in recreating a very large tent in Afghanistan that includes all elements. And you have to be able to have that political will in order to sit at the table or on the floor, as Afghans do, and to be able to have a discussion. And this discussion has to go through stages. And we know by now what the Taliban strategy is. I think they're playing hardball. The Taliban have seen and they have experienced with the Americans that they have to be very precise about what they want, and they ask very precise questions, and they have very precise goals. They will do the same with Kabul, let's say, and they will do the same with the negotiating team. And the negotiating team has to be a very strong team. It has to be a very cohesive team. It has to be a very inclusive team. It has to represent real centers of power in Afghanistan. It has to represent the different communities and constituencies of Afghanistan. It does to some point. Hopefully over time it will be stronger. So in order for us to move forward positively and with breakthroughs and with achievements and accomplishments, I think that we really need to be realistic on what's happening on the ground, what's happening with the balance of power, what is happening with tactics, and what we have learned again from the past, whether it was with the American deal with the Taliban or all failed attempts in the past.
Thank you. Minister Mastoor, as a representative of the Afghan government, what can your government potentially do to prevent this rupture of Afghan polity? How can the trust deficit be reduced with the other political actors and between President Ghani and other key actors?
On this issue, after the political agreement between His Excellency the President and Chairman Abdullah, the High Council for National Reconciliation is formed. The High Council structure is in a way that there should be a leadership committee and there should be a General Assembly. So that leadership committee will provide the general guidance and framework for the negotiating team so that they will represent or better represent the Republic view in the negotiation. In the leadership committee, we have all those political leaders, including former President Karzai, including all other the jihadi tanzims leaders, including the government and including the High Council leadership team. That is already in the final stage to be formed and to have the meeting. In the last 1 week, Excellency Dr. Abdullah was very active to reach out all those political leaders, including President Karzai, Mr. Sayaf, and the rest of the leaders, so that a political consensus on this issue is there. So at this time, I think we don't see much difference on that, what you call it as a rupture. It's not there. We have a team. The team will depart most probably tomorrow this time.
Thank you, Minister Mastoor. Ambassador Pontekovo, you're on the ground. You're meeting all these key stakeholders. What role is NATO playing to create political consensus within the Afghan government and its political partners?
Well, on that issue, there is no doubt whatsoever that the perceived political disunity of Afghan leadership is a concern for all of us, for NATO and for the international community, as it also impacts on the cohesiveness of the team, which I hope that once it is on the ground with facing the interlocutor, will find the necessary strength, and I do believe the team is very well placed. It is a diverse team. It is an inclusive team, and it takes care of most layers of society. Of course, it is a pity that this process has been drawn out for reasons that you have already explained, and that the team has not been able to confront significantly itself with the leadership committee and with the High Reconciliation Council. As concerns NATO's role, NATO's role in the in the negotiations will be according to its usefulness, in the sense that we respect fully that this is an inter-Afghan negotiation. We have certain expertise that can be useful for the government, can be useful to form a consensus upon request. And that is, and the catchwords are upon request. As concerns the longer term,
Ambassador Pontecorvo, have you received a request? The request that you have you received such a request?
We have received an invitation to observe by President Ghani, and so that is what we then, we also have our own internal procedures. I represent Secretary General and 30 countries, so that is quite, I thought it was difficult representing one country when I was Italian ambassador, but representing 30 is may you live in interesting times, as your Iron brother says. But apart from that, then in the long term, what we're saying is that NATO is committed to Afghanistan for as long as it takes in the sector of our competence, which is security and defense. That has two conditions, two formal conditions, and one which I imagine is how can I say, a circumstance. The condition is, the first condition on this side is we receive an invitation by whatever government comes out of the IAN to keep doing what we're doing and complete the job, which will then, kind of change because there will be a different reality, and so there are different elements that have to be integrated into it. The second condition is, after the invitation, is that NATO will consider the invitation and consider to accept it or not, and that I think will be on the basis of, as the rest of the international community, I think Minister Mastour was alluding to it, and Ambassador Olson also, is that these are inter-Afghan negotiations. Donors then have a right, and NATO as a peculiar donor, but a kind of both donor in kind and in money, will look at the situation on the ground, and if they like what they see, or if they think they can impact favorably on what they see, then we will. The donor community will do its duty, as it's always done with Afghanistan. But on that, that's as far as I can go at this juncture. And I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Ambassador Pontecorvo. It's interesting that you mentioned the Iron Brother, Pakistan's Iron Brother. And I want to, I'm sure you've seen recent statements, policy statements from Washington about potential need to create a NATO-like alliance for Asia. And we'd just like to ask you whether that policy discussion has resonated with NATO, if that's a separate conversation, or does that a NATO-like alliance for Asia has a bearing on NATO's role in Afghanistan or not?
The two quick answers are no and no, in the sense that everything that happens in Washington, of course, resonates in NATO, but from there to have operational consequences, it does not, either on one side or the other. So we are, NATO's the traditional NATO. We are traditionally committed to this country, but the conditions are changing, and so the two conditions which I was talking about, I say conditions a lot, but I mean these two conditions which will have to come in place for NATO to continue to do a role. This is also because there are a number of expectations, and NATO is ready, is ready, and is ready to consider any eventuality. But the Afghans can very well figure out by themselves what they want as their future. If they want us in their future, they'll tell us, and once they've told us, we will consider what the conditions are. So I mean, I'm repeating myself, so I'll stop it here.
Thank you, Ambassador Pontecorvo. I want to take the same question to Ambassador Olson, actually, who already has two fingers on this. Just the same question, set of questions to you, Ambassador Olson. NATO-like alliance for Asia, and whether that has a bearing on NATO and US role in Afghanistan, present and future.
Well, first of all, the comments about NATO in Asia, I think, are being overinterpreted. This was the Deputy Secretary of State speaking at an event in Washington. He was asked the question whether there should be a NATO in East Asia. And he gave a very nuanced response, which, it would be difficult for me to summarize right now, but people should look at the actual text, in which he suggested, essentially that there was a need for the coming together of countries in the Indo-Pacific region, but he did not, see any prospect for a NATO-like structure emerging in the short term. So I think, it was a nuanced statement, and it needs to be, but I think underlying that, as I said in my initial remarks, there's no question but that the increasing focus of U.S. foreign policy is going to be about dealing with the rise of China. And I think that is one of the reasons why it's important that the U.S. ultimately does see a peaceful and successful transition in Afghanistan, because we see other regional challenges for us to deal with. I also wanted to offer, if I could, just a little bit of commentary on the previous thread of the discussion about the Afghan unity and the question of the republic's unity, because I think there are a couple of points that need to be made here. First of all, there's really no question that the republic has much more potential political support than the Taliban. The Taliban is a small minority and holds a minority position. Consistent polling over decades shows that the idea for ordinary Afghans of voting for their government is a good one, regardless of whether they like the government that comes in or not. I mean, there may be grievances with the individual governance style and various problems and corruption, but they certainly prefer a Republican system of government. And in that regard, democracy is messy. And I know from negotiating with the Taliban that the Taliban negotiators cannot deviate from their instructions, because the consequences for them will be rather severe. In a democracy, that's not the case. And so, of course, there's going to be a greater expression of opinion in a democratic society. All that said, I don't want to be Pollyanna on this. Clearly, there is a problem of a lack of unity on the Afghan government side. But I think what is important is not so much the team. We shouldn't focus on the negotiating team. Negotiators get their instructions, and what counts is the Reconciliation Council back in Kabul and how that works. And I think we'll see. And if the Reconciliation Council can come together and get over the political divisions and mobilize its potential political strength, then there can be a positive outcome, in my view, to these negotiations. And I would just close by reminding them of a thought from the American Revolution. One of our founding fathers said something to the effect, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, that we must hang together or all be hanged separately. And I think that's kind of where, the Afghan Republic leadership side is. And I hope they can rise to that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Olson. Very insightful commentary. Rahimullah Saab, you have studied the Taliban very closely all these years. This point about democracy being messy, the Taliban remaining dedicated to their strategy, if they come to power, and they seem to be cognizant of the value of public opinion. When you look at their strategic communications, they're clearly playing to the galleries. Can the Taliban, do they have the potential to transition from a fighting force to a political organization, to do governance? What is your assessment?
I think that is going to be very challenging. Taliban until now, since they first emerged in 1994-95, have been operating as a fighting force. Uh, they have tried to have a political section, but that has always been the weaker side. Their military side has always been very strong. I don't think they have yet made up their mind regarding democracy, uh, whether they will take part in elections. I think they are still thinking about it. It's an ongoing process. They will decide as they go ahead in the intra-Afghan dialogue because, I expect the Taliban side, to speak with one voice during the negotiations. They have 23 members, but the chief negotiator, as we all know, Sher Mohammad Abbas Tanakzai, he has been doing most of the talking with the Americans, and now I think he will also do the same with the Afghans on the other side. So the Taliban, will have one voice, one position, but I expect the Afghan side, occasionally there will be different voices, different opinions because they belong to different parties. Some people are from the government, some are from the opposition. They represent a democracy, so they will have, maybe more open opinions during the talks. Uh, Taliban, you know, will have to decide eventually whether they want to become part of this political system, whether they want to accept democracy, human rights, women's rights. For example, the UN representative has asked Taliban to include a women in their delegation. You know, they don't have any women among their 23 negotiators, and I don't think they will have one. But the Afghan side, has got five out of the 20 negotiators. So that is the Taliban attitude, even at this stage. They say yes, they support women rights, but then they add according to Islamic teachings. They say they support human rights, but it is according to Islamic teachings. Uh, Regarding democracy, also, they have different views, and we have heard their discussions. There is no consensus, I must say. And in the past, they used to say we can't take part in elections because there is a foreign occupation in Afghanistan. We can't have free and fair elections if there are foreign military presence. Now, when the foreign troops are gone, they would no longer have this excuse. So I think that, they will decide as they move along. And eventually, I think it has to be a democracy, a democratic system that will, I think, set the stage, the rules, how power is transitioned in Afghanistan. Because if you don't agree on that, and if you continue to use violence to capture power, then there can be no peace in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Raimullah Saab. My final question, we're drawing to the conclusion of our session, but my final question is for our esteemed Afghan speakers. First, Dr. Mastoor, and then last, Ambassador Samad. One clear fault line that gets a lot of headlines is the Emirate versus the Republic, the Taliban versus the Afghan polity. But the other Afghan fault line, which will become more significant in weeks and months ahead, is the ethnic fault line within Afghanistan, the Pashtun versus the Persian Afghanistan. And we know that the Iran's special representative to Afghanistan was visiting Kabul this week, and he held meetings with all the key stakeholders. Minister Mastoor, how is the Afghan government, and really how can the ethnic dilemma be addressed while also negotiating a power sharing formula with the Taliban? How do you manage both these fault lines?
Uh, At least one thing I want to mention here, that what in this side, when we are talking about the Republic side, as Yusuf Zayseh was saying, this is a beauty of democracy. They have different views, but at least in one thing which all are in the same view is that they want a united Afghanistan and they want a democratic Afghanistan. At least on this one, they're all in the same page. But then on the rest of the issues, they may have their views, and this is why the Leadership Committee and the General Assembly is formed, that they should discuss, and then they should guide the negotiation team to be in the single voice when they are talking to Taliban. On the issue of how the future government will shape, I don't think that anybody in Afghanistan will talk the next government based on the ethnicity. I hope that at least I've not heard many things inside rather than we've heard it from outside. Let's give the chance to all parties, including Taliban, that they should fight for their own values, and then let the Afghan citizens to decide. But this is not a major concern, and at least we here, we are not very much concerned on this issue. But the current Afghanistan is not the Afghanistan of 1995. It has changed, and there are many other values that we have to be cognizant of them. In 2001, we didn't have, or almost there were no female in the public service. Now we are having over 30%. The same when we're talking about the education for girls. On that time, it was almost zero, except the areas that were not under the Taliban control. Now we are talking about 40% in primary schools at least. So we are not going back. I don't think that anybody will go back. Even we think that Taliban or changed. It is a general consensus that they are not the Taliban of 1995. They have been exposed to the world. Their leaders have lately negotiated the agreement with the US. And the real question is not whether the Taliban have changed, but how they've changed. And it will be more clearer when we are going to the negotiating table. So it is still too early to say a definite yes, whether there will be these type of issues or questions on the table. But overall, we are optimistic.
Thank you, Minister Mastoor. Ambassador Omar Samad, you have the final comment. Do you agree with Dr. Mastoor's assessment? Are ethnic divisions no longer a concern? Pakistan's role gets a lot of media play, but how is Iran supporting the peace process? How do you see the ethnic question gelling in the peace process?
I agree to a large extent with what Dr. Mastoor said in terms of viewpoints and moving forward. But I also am old enough to remember in Afghanistan, pre-war Afghanistan, where there was no ethnic divide, when there were no issues within society that divided us in any way, and we had a stable tent that brought everybody under the tent. Yes, obviously, a lot has changed over the last 42 years. We have polarization that has taken place, unfortunately, in society. And what we need to avoid is maximalist tendencies and positioning. And that applies to the Taliban as well. The Taliban, I agree, have evolved over time, but we do not know enough about how they have evolved and how they are going to shape their viewpoints going forward within the intra-Afghan negotiations. That is obviously if the intra-Afghan negotiations move in the right direction, and if the High Council for Reconciliation can act as the sort of the portrayal of a consensus, and that decisions at the end of the day are taken by consensus, and that it is a democratic process in itself. so that the Taliban understand as well that they are faced with a majority of Afghans. At the end of the day, I think that we need to give the Afghan people the right to decide their destiny and their future. I believe that they can do so. I think that the Taliban have a place, obviously, as a reality on the ground. How that will change and evolve over time, we need to see how that happens. But what happens on all other sides has to be based on, obviously, a shared vision. Because at the end of the day, again, it's political will, and it's also creating a shared vision for Afghanistan and for Afghans, and creating that tent that can accommodate everyone, and ending the war. Because I think that those who think that this war can continue or should continue for whatever reason are going to not only hurt the Afghans even more, but they're also going to hurt whatever prospects other stakeholders have in Afghanistan, whether they're in the region or beyond the region. So I think that the continuation of war in Afghanistan, which could end up being a civil war at the end of the day, and a proxy war, is a lose-lose proposition, and we should avoid that at all costs.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before I go to Sherry, I have a quick question for Ambassador Olson, a final one. What is the US's view of Iran's role in the peace process? How do you view Iran's role shaping up?
Well, Iran is a complicated problem for the United States, obviously, because we, to put it very mildly, we don't have a positive bilateral relationship, clearly. And that makes it a complication for the United States to actually engage with Iran in any meaningful sense, or vice versa. And Iran's position has been rather complicated. On the one hand, it is formally supportive of the government, but it does have, over time, it has developed its links with the Taliban, especially through its intelligence and special forces apparatus. So, it appears that that Iran is somewhat hedging its bets, as indeed other countries in the region may be as well. But I think it's actually quite important. We haven't really talked about this in the context in today's discussion, but it's quite important that there be a regional element to the peace process. And I think the core principle is pretty clear, that the region has to agree that that when peace comes to Afghanistan, Afghanistan's territory will not be used against anyone else in the region. And I'm sure most Afghans would be prepared to agree to that as a condition of the peace process. But it does present an awkwardness in terms of coming together, because, as I said, the United States, which has in some ways exercised some convening authority with regard to the peace process up till now, is not in a position to convene, obviously, Iran. So I think there's a need for someone outside of the United States to take a convening role, whether it's the United Nations or a regional forum or some other institution. And I think that also is part of what maybe is necessary in terms of mediation. The region has actually been playing a very constructive role, whether it's Pakistan, Uzbekistan, other countries, and perhaps this is a challenge that can be faced by the region itself.
So, Ambassador Olson, quick follow-up question. The current the Trump administration's policy seems to be leaning into the role of Afghanistan's neighbors and multilateral institutions to play that role. In case there's a change of administration in Washington, D.C., do you see continuation of the current multilateralism leaning in on neighbors policy, or do you foresee any departures in policy?
Well, if there were a new administration, I mean, one thing I think is somewhat clear. I think there would be some reduction in tensions between the United States and Iran, and there might be greater receptivity to finding win-win solutions. Because fundamentally, I think Iran, the irony, of course, is that Iran and the United States don't fundamentally have divergent interests when it comes to Afghanistan. And the same, by the way, can be said with the United States and China. I mean, Afghanistan is an area where, in theory, most of the regional players have interests that ultimately somewhat align with the United States. So, in more general terms, I don't see a great shift coming in Afghanistan policy with either potential administration. I think we're likely to be on the path of following Doha. And as I said, the main question will be what happens in May of 2021 with the question of the final withdrawal.
Thank you, Ambassador Olson. Very useful. With this, we're coming to the close of our session. May I request Senator Sherry Rahman, chair of our session, to share her concluding remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Amara. I hope you can hear me. And I, first of all, want to thank everyone for their intellectual resource and time and patience that they've brought to Jinnah Institute's webinar that seeks to actually deconstruct what we don't know and what we need to know about the peace process, and how all of us can be partners in building knowledge and momentum on this great endeavor. Quickly, the discussion cut a very wide swathe. It was beyond, it went beyond remit. But having said that, that's how this peace process will need to go. It will need to break many boundaries of skepticism and actually facts on the ground for it to become a meaningful and sustainable partnership that Kabul is able to build. And I say Kabul because I want to, at this point, quickly also acknowledge what Ambassador Stefano Potterberg said about this being history in the making. And, most of us are watching this. We're not holding our breath, I have to say, but we're watching this with great interest and a commitment to stability and peace. But having said history, I'm from Pakistan, and ultimately that is the platform that we do represent as makers of peace. And we're looking at a question of history here, where really there's a strong sense of anxiety over how this will play out between a posture that is taken, as Ambassador Olson said, when the exit gets messy. Well, strong communication and stratcom machines tend to lay the PowerPoint and the blame somewhere else. Having been at one of the receiving ends as Pakistan of that particular blame game, and having been called a spoiler, I want to say that there's been a very strategic change in Pakistan's view since, I would say, 2010. Ambassador Olson has been a witness to that slow shift. It's been creaky, but it's very real. It's an investment in inclusive peace and stability in the region. Afghanistan is not Pakistan's backyard. We cannot afford it to be, if anyone even wants to think about it, because those are questions that are coming to me as I'm watching, as I'm on my cell phone. And many of us are asking for this to be said, really, that, Pakistan's fought a very long and hard battle against terrorism, and part of it was fought on the badlands of the Afghan border. There were many slips here between cup and lip, but eventually, I have to say that after paying a very heavy price in thousands of wars and a great deal of civilian and military harm, we saw that we have made some headway. Now, the reason I bring this up is because of two reasons. The reason Pakistan is so vested in Afghan stability, both economically, for trade, for connectivity, but also for political and military stability, is because there's always been a spillover in the past, and it's been transformative for Pakistani society. And here I want to say that the sacrifice Pakistan has made on those borderlands and within our own country from the 30 years ago when we fought the wrong war with the United States against the Soviet Union, well, that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. We don't want this peace process to collapse under the weight of its contradictions. We want the Afghan people to choose whom they want and to take responsibility for their future, which I think they're desperately trying to do. Our role is of an enabler, of a supporter, and at no point can Pakistan guarantee any outcomes. This is something I flagged last time, and I'm going to keep repeating this because when things go south, very often I notice that if the reduction in violence isn't yielding a sustainable ceasefire or the violence is in uptick, and I have to point out, appreciate Ambassador Mastoor and Ambassador Samad also pointing out that there has been an uptick in violence, and we are speaking um, of really our ambitions here. Most of our conversations have been about our ambitions. You're principally Afghanistan and, of course, the international community that has been supporting Afghanistan. So there's a stated ambition, and that's an important ideal end state. I think all of us have come to one conclusion finally, but we are still fighting and talking. Ambassador Olson, you know what I'm talking about. We used to be suggesting that the Taliban conversation began much earlier when they had less battlefield successes than they do now. They have far more strategic agility and tactical advantage than they used to, say, in 2011 when we would be urging this. And timing is crucial. Timing is crucial because the balance of power will fall the one way or the other. Now, all the gains that Afghanistan has made, the change in Afghanistan, the young people, the women, everyone coming together, uh, this is something that needs to be negotiated with more a cohesive political power from Kabul, meaning more unity, that's clear, um, because an opposition always, an adversary even across the negotiating table, always cashes in on a divide and on the other side. So I would keep on urging unity in Kabul, and of course the intra-Afghan negotiations must be strong. They must be cohesive. They must yield place to women, of course, and they must also move beyond the shall I say, the milestones of building confidence much faster than I see them, because there is, as Ambassador Olson and the NATO mission must also be thinking of the 2021 timeline. There is a milestone coming up. It will be there very fast, and the security vacuum that could potentially accrue in Afghanistan if the US forces continue on their path to what they call a clean exit. I had to be more diplomatic than Ambassador Olson and not call it a dirty exit, but a precipitous one, or perhaps an irresponsible one, could reverse many gains. And we do hope that all the sacrifice of the Afghan people on all sides, including Pakistan, would not become footnotes to history in from as we transition from the fog of a bitter war to the smog of a peace that we are still feeling our way through. Once again, I'm going to say it needs the backing of strong engagement from the international community, both in terms of transitioning from a war economy to a sustainable one. It will, of course, be in the increment, and being very careful about the narcotics trade, which is not mentioned anywhere, but it is booming again. It's something that Pakistan is very concerned about, and we would urge NATO also to look at it in all agreements signed. And lastly, I would just want to thank everyone's commitment to the same end goal. And I think that's what's important here. The messaging is important, the end goals are important, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to keep looking at the facts on the ground and hope that change is going to be realized faster than the increment we're seeing. For that, there really does have to be a sustained reduction in violence. And with those words, I'm going to say, well, hope is not a plan, and clearly everybody in the room has some sense of what that plan is. Let's hope we can talk about it in better weather in between Pakistan, Washington, Brussels, and of course Kabul. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, Amara, for that wonderful hosting, and I look forward to engaging with all old friends and new. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sherry Rahman, for the excellent concluding remarks, for reminding actually that Pakistan and Afghanistan have suffered jointly over the last 20 years, and for reiterating the commitment, the national commitment, the regional commitment, the overall international commitment for making the peace process work this time. On behalf of Jinnah Institute, I want to thank all our esteemed panelists, Dr. Mustafa Mastoor, Ambassador Stefano Pontecorvo, Ambassador Rick Olson, Ambassador Omar Samad, and Rahimullah Yousafzai Saab, for your very valuable time, frank and rich insights to make this discussion useful. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and we hope to engage with all of you in our next conversation on Afghanistan as the peace process moves forward. Thank you, and good evening and good morning wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.